This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. In each episode, we bring you information, insights, and ideas from some of the industry's top thought leaders. Connect with us to help pick the topic and guide the show.
This is Media Sales Mastery, the podcast for media sales professionals. I'm your host, Jamie Wood, and this is the final episode for the year. It's been a great year, 2024. Lots of travel. I have to admit, keeping this podcast committed to that regular fortnightly upload schedule is a challenge at times. There's a few hacks I tried, like recording 2 episodes at once and doing a 1 and a 2, trying to batch record and let them all kind of flow, or doing a few more solo episodes. So thanks for hanging in there. Probably I'd give myself like a C- for this year's effort with the podcast, or at least the quality. In 2025, I'm committing to doing a much better job, being better forward planned and having more thoughtful discussion, and maybe thinking a bit more strategically around what topics we choose to tackle and which guests we choose to have on. With that said, I wanted to end the year with a rebroadcast of a podcast I just did recently when I was on holiday in Japan, actually. I did it remotely. It is a interview where I'm actually the one being interviewed, and it is all around the lost art of cold calling. So I think, cold calling seems to be something that is increasingly falling out of favor with frontline media sales professionals, even in the direct media sales space. People are thinking of different outreach channels being more preferential, be it email, be it LinkedIn. In some markets around the world, things like WhatsApp are kind of the primary channel. And I know a lot of people are doing stuff with like social media, like even sliding into the DMs of a brand on Instagram. So I'm not suggesting for a moment that cold calling is the only way to prospect. I'm not suggesting that it is superior. Well, I kind of am, actually. I do think that cold calling is still the best way. But I thought this was a good topic to end the year on because it's sort of a taboo topic. It's something that I think is just really good to get in the weeds and just get really tactical and talk about. And my goal here would just be to maybe re-inspire you. If you're going into next year and you're looking to build your business, you may be selling in a tighter market, the channels that you've been using to kind of reach out to new prospects are becoming a little bit less effective. Just have a think about going back to the brilliant basics of cold calling. So that's what this is all about. Thank you for your support, as always, of the podcast. To be honest, I don't really care if you like it. I don't care if you follow it. I don't really need you to leave me a review. What I do ask, sincerely, the one thing I would ask you to do is go back and find one of your favorite episodes and share it with somebody else. Whether you text it to them, whether you send them a link to the show, whether you share it in your team sales meeting, whether you post about it on LinkedIn. What really helps me is just people who this podcast would be valuable for or would find this podcast interesting, getting the podcast into the ears of those people. That is the only thing that matters to me. So if I can ask you, if you're a fan of the podcast, if you've been listening for a while, if you've gone out of your way to send me a nice thank you message on LinkedIn, which I do appreciate, all I ask is that you pay it forward and you share this podcast with somebody else who you think might get some value from it. The only other thing that's worth flagging, or maybe just getting you to think about, is I'm still tossing around this idea of what do I do as a more live extension of the podcast? And I do think like an in-person event next year, piloted in one market, like a media sales masterclass style event, is something I want to do. I'm going to set it as a 2025 goal when I sit down and do my planning. So if that sounds like it's something of interest, if you're based in Australia and you think that you might like to come along and be part of that pilot group, send me a note on LinkedIn. Would love to hear from you. I just want to test a theory with that. And the more interest I get from people, the more confidence I'd have that it's worthwhile spending the time to invest. So here is the episode. Thank you again, and I look forward to talking to you in 2025.
Media Sales Mastery.
Sales Reinvented Podcast, episode number 421. Hi, this is Paul Watts from the Sales Reinvented Podcast. Here at Sales Reinvented, we're on a mission to change the negative perception of salespeople with a vision of making selling a profession to be proud of. Joining me on today's show is Jamie Wood. Jamie has over 14 years of media sales leadership experience, including out-of-home, radio, podcasting, esports, and digital. He joined Boost Media International in 2023 after leading revenue and operations for Media and ARN. Jamie has driven record market share results, diversified revenues, and commercialized new media platforms. Based in Brisbane, he can be reached at jamie@boostmedia.com.au. Jamie, welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Paul.
It's great to have you on the show, Jamie. Now, Jamie, as you know, today we're going to be talking about cold calling, and I wanted to start by asking you, is cold calling still relevant today? And how do you define it?
Cold calling to me is really any form of direct outreach to a prospective client. But specifically, I think the term is used for the phone-based outreach. I absolutely believe it still has a place in the modern selling environment. In fact, I think that cold calling is something of a lost art form, and anyone who has a really highly curated skill set and has spent time developing their skill set in cold calling is going to be very highly effective in sales. Now, I will concede the way we cold call has probably adapted in the last 10 years. There are far more channels that you can outreach to a prospective advertiser, in my case, in media, but certainly a prospective client. In any case, there are less gatekeepers. There's more focus on getting people directly on their mobile phone or their cell phone. There's more focus on using multiple channels to maybe warm up a client, like multi-channel prospecting. With all that said, I still think that cold calling is highly, highly valuable. And there's probably two main reasons, Paul. One, it is still the quickest and most effective way to connect with a prospective client. And two, it's actually becoming one of the least cluttered prospecting channels. There are far too many sellers that are so intimidated by the phone and so intimidated by cold call that they actually avoid it and favor other channels like email or LinkedIn or events.
I think you might be onto something there, Jamie. I would agree with you. I think it is somewhat of a lost art. And as such, I think anybody who is still picking up the phone is probably finding that customers are much more amenable to picking up the phone and talking to them because they're being bombarded through all the other channels that you just mentioned.
Absolutely.
So, Jamie, let me ask you this question then. You alluded to this earlier, but it has been suggested that cold calling is both an art and a science. What are your thoughts on that?
I think it is art and science, but a lot of the science stuff actually feels like art. And I think this is where we often stumble. I think the science part is something we don't talk nearly enough about. The way that you can hack someone's brain, as they call it, the limbic hijack, the way you can use your voice, your language, your tonality, your pacing, the way that a smile can be felt through the phone. All of this feels like some form of dark arts, but it's actually very scientific and very science-based. With that said, the important thing I think to remember here, Paul, is there is no such thing as a perfect cold call. They are awkward. They are bumpy. They almost never go exactly as planned. And guess what? That's actually okay.
I love that term, the limbic hijack. I'm just writing it down as we speak, but what a great answer. So let me ask you this question then, Jamie. How do you prepare for a cold calling session to ensure that you're in the right frame of mind and that you are ready to engage clients? Can you walk us through your process, please?
Absolutely. I time block. It's a disciplined practice of actually blocking out time in the calendar. And the reframe that I think needs to happen is you need to treat your cold calling session the same way that you would treat it if you were external doing a face-to-face client meeting. You are not contactable. You are not monitoring emails. You are not reading text messages. You are unavailable for the time that you have blocked out to do your prospecting. I think another one is I tend to try and do it in a point of the day when I'm unlikely to be distracted by other work, other urgent requests. Given a lot of the work that I do is actually international, a big part I also need to balance and consider is the time zones of the prospective clients that I'm actually prospecting. But it's important to minimize the anxiety and to ensure that you've got a time that you've protected in your calendar where you can be solely focused on that activity of prospecting.
I love that idea of a protected time block. I think that's so important because you're right. I mean, cold calling can be challenging for certain salespeople and they will look for any excuse to get out of making those calls. So to your point, if we can just completely prioritize prospecting, make it the only thing that we're doing for the next hour, that way there's no getting out of it. You know what needs to be done and you can then focus on getting it done.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Paul.
So, Jamie, in your experience, what have been some of the opening lines or techniques that you found to be most effective when it comes to capturing a prospect's interest within those first few seconds of the call?
Well, I think the referral-based outreach is one of the best ways to really have a cold call effectively kind of shortcut to being able to have a level of trust and familiarity. So someone you know has passed on this person's details, someone you've spoken to has suggested that you reach out to this person, being able to really leverage a familiar name that the prospect might know as that initial outreach, I think is really important. The other part can be kind of looking at their LinkedIn or doing some research on this prospect and seeing if at any point you've crossed paths with them. Maybe you've worked in a similar industry before, you've worked in a workplace where you might know people that they've worked with. Maybe you've been to an event that they attended and you can potentially say that you may have crossed paths there. Really treating the cold call as if it's not a complete cold outreach and showing that there's some link there with the prospect, I found is always one of the most effective ways to get into the opening line of the cold call. Now, if you're in a situation where you've not got the ability to do that, I think being really transparent and disclosing that you're calling this person out of the blue, really letting them know, not so much referring to it as a cold call, but saying, look, I'm actually calling you a bit out of the blue here. The reason I thought that it was worthwhile reaching out to you is X. And then you launch into your value proposition or your valid business reason for calling. I think one of the best pieces of advice I ever got, and this was very early in my cold calling career, was just to really treat a cold call like any other phone call that you're making. Don't try to put on a facade. Don't try to use a different voice. Call the office of this person like you're calling to speak to your mum or your dad. It's about just having it be a very natural, very familiar sounding voice on the end of the phone. I find can really typically set up that opening line or that opening technique to have the call set up for success.
I think that is great advice, Jamie. And as I think back to some of the best cold calls that I've received, I think the other person was warm, they were engaging, and they spoke to me almost like they knew me. It put me at ease right away. So I can see why that would be good advice for our salespeople on the call. So let me ask you this question then, Jamie. In your experience, what is the ideal length for a cold call? And how do we keep that conversation engaging? Should we be scripting, for example?
Well, the answer to that is there's no perfect length for a cold call, but my personal view would be as short as necessary to secure the meeting. Okay. And I think that's a tendency that some salespeople need to resist, is to actually stay on the call too long, but conversely to rush the call as well. I'm a big believer that you need to resist the urge to go too deep into your pitch. The purpose of a cold call, 90% of the time, is to generate enough intrigue with that prospect to secure a proper meeting. And if you can do that efficiently in 30 seconds, then that's a successful cold call. If you need to have 2 to 3 minutes of overcoming initial objections or finding an area of relevance, and that cold call might take a bit longer, that's completely okay. So the answer there is a cold call really should just be as short as necessary to secure that next critical follow-up. To your point around scripts, I think scripts are an absolute necessity as a starting point. But the thing that's really important to remember is that a script is designed to be iterated and refined in real time. The trick is to not just practice the words, but the intonation, the phrasing, the pacing. As you do more of these calls, you can start to do some testing and start to go, you know, when I said that like that, it really seemed to kind of land. But when I said this, it felt a bit awkward. So a script is an amazing starting point. It is a necessity for somebody who is new to selling and cold calling because it is something of a safety net that you could default to. But I'm a really big believer in use the script, but continue to find a way to improve and refine and tweak and adapt the script based on how you feel it's performing with your prospecting.
I think that is great advice, Jamie. So, Jamie, are there any tools or technologies that you say are indispensable for a modern cold caller? How do you, or how should you, measure the success of your cold calling efforts? What metrics, for example, do you focus on?
One of the tools that I'm playing around with a lot at the moment, where I'm having some great success, is the premium version of ChatGPT. And one of the things that allows you to do is actually ingest websites, about pages, annual reports, financial reports of companies that you're prospecting. And you can actually, in the space of a few minutes, have ChatGPT Premium ingest all of that content and spit out a really quick summary or overview of that prospect what you can also do is actually link it back to your company about page or your product and get it to give you some valid business reasons or some potential reasons why there would be a match between your two companies. So that's a tool that I've only just started using, but I'm finding that to be incredibly helpful in shortcutting the amount of time it takes to research and prepare for a call. I think LinkedIn Sales Navigator, Paul, is a necessity for any modern seller. I think it just allows you to very quickly visualize what that organizational structure is. It allows you to get an understanding of some key metrics to see if they're the right prospect for you, company size, number of staff, size of turnover. One of the other ones that I've been using a lot lately is Cognism. Cognism, sort of like Zoom Info, is very much just a self-serve platform where you can go and search for contact details, direct contact details of prospective clients. It marries up beautifully with Sales Navigator and allows you to really cut down that research time trying to source direct contact information for your prospects. And I think in the role that I'm in, obviously we are a global media consultancy, so we service all different regions around the world. The odd time zone converter is very handy, needing to make sure that whilst I might be in business hours where I'm based in Australia, that we're also prospecting at an appropriate time and calling those people at an appropriate time in their time zone and region of the world. I think my style of outreach has to be more of a sniper style outreach, mainly because we have a very specific niche offering for a very particular type of customer. If I was selling mass, where I was making hundreds of calls in a given week, I think one of the other tools that's really worth considering is an automatic dialer. That is something that people have said really increases the efficiency and the output of a sales team, is having that technology to go and do the call. And once you get a successful connect, then you have the prospect on the phone.
I think that was a great answer. And I agree with you wholeheartedly on the paid for version of ChatGPT and LinkedIn Sales Navigator. I think when you combine those two tools together, I think you have a very, very powerful sales stack for when it comes to cold calling. Let me ask you this question then, but this is usually our most popular segment in any show. But what I'm going to ask you to do, Jamie, is to share with our listeners your top 3 cold calling do's and your top 3 cold calling don'ts.
Number 1 for cold calling do, set a goal for the session. Number of meetings booked, number of calls made, number of rejections you get. It doesn't matter. Set a goal and focus on sitting there and prospecting until you reach that goal. Because that is, I think, one of the most critical things that people need to remember is cold calling is not about motivation. It is about discipline. And setting a goal is the absolute do. It's a non-negotiable. Number 2, use a call sheet or work from a hit list. So what I mean by that is really sit there and actually have a call sheet in front of you with all of the prospective clients that you wish to contact, and have that be the only thing that's really in front of you and visible. Number 3 is be persistent, park the ego, think about the goal. The goal is not to have an amazingly smooth, slick phone call. It is to book a meeting. Okay, cold calls are awkward. Cold calls are stumbly, they're mumbly, they meander, they go in all different directions. Really don't think about your ego. Think about the goal that you wish to achieve, which is to book the meeting. Those would be my 3 do's. My 3 don'ts, and the first one is an absolute critical one, and I am very guilty of this and need to do better. Do not prospect in front of your email inbox. There is always going to be an email that comes in that is more urgent or more important than the prospecting block that you're doing. Don't do it. Okay, treat it like you're in an external meeting. Number 2, don't apologize for disturbing the prospect when they answer the phone. I think the thing that is a really powerful reframe here is if somebody has answered the phone from a phone number they don't recognize, they've consented to that conversation. They have said that I'm going to answer this phone and I'm going to see what the purpose of this call is. Don't make any apologies for disturbing them. I think it's a really critical thing that we just need to remember is that they've consented to have that interaction. And unless they tell you they no longer consent, just assume that they're there to have the conversation. And the last one I think is really important, and I speak a lot about this, is don't leave any call without getting something of value. So what I mean is we typically look at cold calls as either a yes or a no, or a success or a failure. It's important to think about a cold call as more of a marketing activity. Prospecting is about more than just getting meetings. Prospecting is about learning about the market you're selling into. It's about gaining information and intel you can use to refine your pitch. It's about building your profile as somebody who knows what they're talking about and has a potentially relevant solution now and into the future. So don't leave the call without getting something. If it's not an agreement to meet, it's a commitment to have a call at a later date to discuss. It's a referral to another client who may very well be relevant for this. It's a referral to someone else in their organization who may be more interested or capable in having the call. Or importantly, it's some intel or an insight or a piece of information about that particular sector that you can then take and fold into the next pitch that you do.
Wow, what a great list of do's and don'ts. And I really, really like the don't apologize. Consent is implied when they answer the phone. Such a great point, because you're right. Far too many cold callers, and I include myself in this, we're quick to apologize. I'm sorry to disturb you. I know you're busy. But you know what? They picked up the phone. They've consented to that conversation. So stop apologizing. I think that's a great point. I can't believe we're here already, Jamie, but we are actually at the last question. So what I'm going to ask you to do, please, is to share with our listeners how you handle objections or rejections on cold calls. And could you share a memorable example where you were able to turn a challenging call around?
Yeah, so I started my career in media sales, selling direct radio advertising. So basically, small to medium businesses, cold calling them and asking if they'd be interested in a meeting to understand how they could advertise on my radio station. I think one of the common objections that I used to receive was, we've used radio before, it didn't work for our business. There were a lot of people who had maybe done a little bit of a test campaign in radio, they dabbled in it, it hadn't been effective, they hadn't had a good experience, and effectively they were maybe burnt a bit by the medium. That was very common, and I think that was one that used to be quite challenging to come up against on a cold call. What I used to find would be a great way to overcome that would be to actually get them to articulate exactly what that experience was like. So, we've used radio before, it didn't work. Oh, I'm really sorry to hear that. Can I ask, what radio station did you work with? How long ago was this? That's a great radio station. It's really disappointing to hear that that didn't work. Do you think that it was something to do with the campaign? Was it something to do with the message? Was it that the audience wasn't a right fit? What do you think the missing component was there? Okay, look, thank you for that. So again, you can see, Paul, how I'm sort of trying to draw out the information. But what you're able to do there is to go, look, it seems to me that maybe there were some critical components missing to the campaign and to the strategy. Maybe I should come out, let's have a coffee. I might see if I can actually audit the last campaign you did. Let me take you through the methodology that we apply to ensure that that experience doesn't happen for our clients. Is that okay? Can I come and see you next Wednesday? I used to find that was a really effective way to overcome that type of objection. And it was really about being transparent and being curious and inquisitive. I think objection handling, too often we think of objection handling as having this really great script or this really great message that we can then just rebut the client's or the prospect's challenge or refusal to meet with us. We can kind of throw back this script at them. I think importantly, people just like to feel heard. And I think in this case, just questioning and uncovering and drawing out that information, it's probably one of the better ways to do it. So that to me is probably an example of where I've overcome the challenge. I think when it comes to more broadly just handling objections or rejections during a cold call, there is a bit of a reframe that I think can really help, which is you need to ensure that this potential prospect is right for you too. So your job is not to persuade them or convince them that your business is right for them. You need to see if there is a relevant match between your two businesses. So in many ways, you need to be emboldened on this call to actually ask the question, hey, maybe this isn't right for you. Maybe you aren't actually right for the service or product that we are actually potentially proposing to you today too. Let's have a conversation around where there might be some overlap or there might be some alignment here. So that can actually really quickly change your whole mindset from being, I need to secure this meeting with this client to, I need to see if this client is the right fit for me too. And I'm going to uncover that through some good questioning. I'm going to uncover that through talking about what it is we do and just feeling them out. And at the end of the day, we may actually agree at the end of the call that it's not worthwhile either of us meeting because of the fact that this isn't relevant. So that's probably my two techniques. One is about a reframe and one is about really being inquisitive and curious and ensuring that you can draw information out of that prospect rather than just firing off a rebuttal.
What a great answer, Jamie. And I love that idea of reframing the question or reframing your approach to such a way that you're disqualifying them, not the other way around. Because you're right. I think many salespeople, when they get on a cold call, they feel that they're some audition for the next role of vendor in that customer's play. And the reality is that you're right. You're vetting customers in the same way they're vetting vendors. So I think it's really, really important that you recognize that, hey, if you're bringing value to companies, you need to make sure that you're bringing the right value to the right companies. And I want to make sure that I'm not wasting your time and my time. So I think that's a great insight.
It's a very valuable psychological shift, and it really makes the way you approach cold calling feel a lot more comfortable, Paul. So I really would recommend anyone who's selling a lot and doing a lot of these calls, just try to have that pivot, try to think a little bit differently. I guarantee you'll find that you go into the call with a lot more confidence and you have a much more productive conversation.
That is a great way to end today's call, Jamie. Unfortunately, that is all that we've got time for today. And Jamie, as you know, our mission here at Sales Reinvented is to change the negative perception of salespeople with a vision of making selling a profession to be proud of. And I'm absolutely certain that if our listeners could just take on board some of the wonderful insights that you've shared today, that we're going to go a long way to realizing that mission and that vision. So thank you so much for coming on the show today.
My pleasure, Paul. Thank you so much for the conversation, and I wish you very well.
Awesome. Great job, Jamie. Thank you for listening, and please join us on our next podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions for the show, please go to our website, salesreinvented.com. Until next time, remember the ABCs of selling. Always be consultative. I'm Paul Watts, and you have been listening to the Sales Reinvented Podcast.